A judge insulted Pam Bondi in open court, and minutes later, she had him in handcuffs. An astonishing turn of events no one saw coming. Pam Bondi was no stranger to pressure. She had spent years in the legal trenches, tackling some of the toughest cases in the country, but today felt different. As she stepped into the courtroom of Judge Howard Gates, a man infamous for his sharp tongue and unpredictable rulings, she knew this wouldn't be an ordinary hearing. The case was a high-stakes government ethics violation with the potential to shake up more than just a few careers. The defendant, a wealthy developer with deep political ties, stood accused of funneling state funds into his private projects. The evidence was stacked high, and Bondi had come prepared. What she hadn't anticipated was the hostility radiating from the bench before she even spoke a word. Judge Gates barely looked up as she approached the plaintiff's table. Instead, he flipped through a file with deliberate slowness, letting the courtroom sit in silence, the kind designed to make a statement. Finally, without meeting her gaze, he spoke. "Ms. Bondi, I assume you've prepared something of substance today, or should we just skip ahead to the part where you waste my time?" A few chuckles rippled from the defendant's legal team, in the back. Bondi ignored them. She'd faced worse. "Your Honor, I believe the evidence will speak for itself. This case involves the misuse of taxpayer dollars, and my job is to ensure the facts are presented accurately." Gates leaned back in his chair, feigning boredom. "Taxpayer dollars, right? Because that's never been the foundation of a frivolous case before." Bondi's jaw tightened, but she kept her tone steady. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I would hardly call felony corruption charges frivolous." Their eyes met briefly, his cold and calculating, hers unwavering. Before she could continue, he cut her off again. "Ms. Bondi, spare me the lectures. Just get to the point. I don't have all day to entertain whatever grandstanding you have planned." A murmur spread through the gallery. The courtroom wasn't packed, but those present were alert, sensing something off. Judges could be tough, but this felt personal. Bondi took a slow breath, recalibrating. She knew what was happening. Gates wanted her off balance to control the tempo and put her on the defensive. She wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. Picking up a folder from the table, she flipped it open. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. These financial records clearly demonstrate, do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork, or is this just your way of compensating?" Gates interrupted. The shift in the room was instant. The defense attorney smirked, reporters exchanged glances, but Bondi didn't flinch. She'd learned long ago that men like Judge Gates thrived on intimidation. The only way to beat them was to never let them see you rattled. She paused, just long enough to make a statement without words, then set the folder down and clasped, her hands together. "Your Honor, if you prefer to continue making this personal, I'm happy to request a recess while we address any professional concerns you may have." It was subtle, not aggressive, not disrespectful, but pointed. A clear warning she wouldn't roll over. The judge's lips curled slightly. Was it amusement or annoyance? Hard to tell, but he wasn't done. "Oh, I don't have concerns, Ms. Bondi. I just know a weak case when I see one." This time, the reaction wasn't just murmurs. A few gasps broke out. Someone whispered under their breath. This wasn't how a judge was supposed to conduct a hearing. Pam felt the room shift, eyes darting between her and Gates like a tennis match. She wasn't going to engage in a shouting match. That's what he wanted. Instead, she adjusted her blazer, straightened her papers, and looked him dead in the eye. "Then I suppose we should let the evidence do the talking." But as she spoke, she caught something in his expression. Not just arrogance, not just condescension, but a flicker of something deeper, like a man with a stake in the outcome. That's when she knew. This wasn't just courtroom theatrics. Judge Gates had something to hide. And what he didn't know was that she did too. Bondi had been in tense hearings before, but this was different. Gates wasn't just ruling from the bench. He was playing a game, a calculated attempt to undermine her in front of everyone. But why? She could feel his stare as she moved through. Her arguments, every word met with him waiting to pounce. She saw it in the slight curl of his lips, the slow tap of his fingers on the bench, daring her to keep going. She wasn't about to stop. "Your Honor," she said, keeping her tone measured, "these documents show a clear discrepancy in the funding allocations. The defendant's company received nearly triple the amount approved in the original budget, and none of it was accounted for in the state records." She turned slightly, gesturing toward the projection screen where the financial statements were displayed. "Now, if you look here, Ms. Bondi," Gates cut in, his voice dripping with that same smug edge, "I hate to interrupt your presentation. Really, I do. But I think we've seen enough numbers for one day." She glanced at him, then back at the screen. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. "Your Honor, with all due respect, these numbers are the foundation of the case," he scoffed. "Right. And yet I fail to see anything that justifies wasting the court's time like this." There it was again. Wasting time. He was trying to bury this case before it even got off the ground. She heard a soft rustle behind her, the prosecution team shifting, exchanging looks. They felt it too. Something wasn't right. Bondi tightened her grip on her pen, flipping to the next page in her file. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to—" "Denied," he snapped. She looked up. "I haven't even stated the motion yet." "And yet I can already tell you it's going nowhere," he said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the bench. "Let's be honest, Ms. Bondi, this entire case is built on speculation. A little creative accounting and suddenly you're crying corruption." The defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a navy suit, smirked. He hadn't had to say a word. Gates was doing all the work for him. Bondi exhaled slowly. "Your Honor, are you refusing to allow my motion before hearing its contents?" A pause, a beat too long. "I'm refusing to indulge this circus act any longer." The courtroom wasn't just tense now, it was electric, eyes darting, heads turning. Even the reporters were scribbling faster. Bondi caught the glance of a juror, a woman in her 50s wearing a dark blazer, her brows furrowed, lips pressed together. She wasn't the only one taking notice. Arrogance makes people pay attention. Bondi squared her shoulders. "Very well, Your Honor. Then let's proceed with the next piece of evidence." She turned back to the screen, clicking to the next slide. "This document obtained through a subpoena shows that—" "Ms. Bondi," Gates interrupted, his tone sharper. "Now." She stopped, looked at him. He was no longer leaning back, no longer smug. His hands were clasped, his mouth a thin, hard line. Something had changed. "Approach the bench," he said. It wasn't a request. She hesitated, then set her papers down and walked toward him. The courtroom hushed. When she reached the bench, he lowered his voice just enough for only her to hear. "I'd strongly suggest you reconsider the direction you're taking here, Ms. Bondi." She tilted her head slightly. "Excuse me?" "I'm saying," he murmured, "that some fights aren't worth having." She let that sit in the air between them, then leaned in just an inch closer. "I don't scare easily, Judge Gates." A muscle in his jaw twitched. She turned and walked back to her table. That moment told her everything she needed to know. Her mind raced as she returned to her seat. That wasn't just a power move, it was a warning, a veiled threat disguised as judicial authority. But why? She'd expected pushback, maybe even hostility, but this was deeper. Judge Gates wasn't just biased, he was protecting something, or someone. She adjusted her papers, keeping her expression neutral. The prosecution team beside her shifted, waiting for her to react. She didn't. Not yet. Instead, she lifted her chin and faced the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to continue presenting my evidence." Gates didn't respond immediately, letting the silence linger as if deciding how far to push. Then, finally, "Proceed, but keep it brief." She didn't acknowledge the jab. Reaching for the next file, she continued. "This document is a contract signed between the defendant and the city's planning board, outlining the proposed project expenses. You'll notice the listed cost totals just over $2 million. She paused, then placed another sheet on the projector with deliberate precision. "However, this is an internal ledger from the defendant's company showing the actual funds transferred were nearly double that amount." She placed a third document down. "And here is the approval signature, signed off by," she hesitated, letting the weight land, "Judge Howard Gates." The courtroom didn't just shift, it cracked. Eyes darted, pens scratched. The defense attorney stiffened, his smugness wiped clean. Judge Gates didn't move. For the first time since she'd stepped into the room, his face was unreadable. Bondi let the silence hang, then continued. "Your Honor, would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving the defendant?" It was a calculated risk. She didn't have the full story yet, but she had enough to shake his foundation. Gates shifted slightly, his fingers pressed together, knuckles whitening. "That document," he said slowly, "is inadmissible." She tilted her head. "How so?" "It was obtained improperly." She let that sink in. "Your Honor, this document was subpoenaed by my office." His nostrils flared. "Then it was mishandled. I'm ruling it inadmissible. It will not be considered by this court." The shift wasn't just in the gallery now. It was everywhere. The jury, the stenographer, even the bailiff. Everyone was watching. Bondi crossed her arms, her tone calm. "You do realize this is a public hearing, correct? That the media is here? That every person in this room just saw you declare critical financial evidence inadmissible without reason?" A muscle in his jaw jumped. "That's enough, Ms. Bondi." She didn't move, didn't blink. Then, slowly, she sat down. And that's when she changed everything. Reaching into her case, she pulled out a small recorder, placed it on the table, and pressed play. A voice filled the courtroom, low, gruff, unmistakable. "Take care of it. I don't care how." The recording crackled, then continued. "Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers." Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Judge Gates didn't move, didn't breathe. Bondi didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Everyone had heard him now, and the real game was about to begin. The recording ended, leaving a stunned realization in its wake. No murmurs, no whispers, just the weight of what had happened. Across the room, the defense attorney blinked, his composure slipping, the smirk replaced by dread. He glanced at his client, the wealthy developer, who looked pale. Judge Gates cleared his throat. "Ms. Bondi, I don't know where you obtained that recording, but—" "That's not the question you should be asking, Your Honor," she interrupted, her voice unwavering. "The real question is, who were you talking to?" His fingers curled into fists. "This is outrageous," he snapped. "This hearing is descending into chaos because of your grandstanding." "Chaos?" Bondi repeated, her tone light, almost amused. "I'd say this is clarity. Finally, we have some transparency in this courtroom." The tension notched higher. She let him sweat, then reached for another document and slid it across the table. "Your Honor, this is a transcript of a wiretap legally obtained during our investigation. It corroborates everything you just heard on that recording." Gates stared at the page but didn't touch it, his breathing suddenly louder. Bondi turned slightly. "Officer Reynolds, would you kindly read the highlighted section aloud?" The bailiff hesitated, then picked up the transcript, his voice steady but heavy. "We'll take care of her. Bondi doesn't have anything solid yet, but if she does, I'll make sure it never sees the inside of a courtroom." A sharp inhale came from the gallery. Bondi folded her hands. "I'd like to submit this as evidence, Your Honor." Gates's eyes flickered toward the exit. A tiny movement, but enough. Enough for the room to realize he was thinking about escape. But it was too late. "Motion denied," he barked. She raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "This hearing is over," he continued, his voice a fraction too loud. "I will not allow—" "Judge Gates," Bondi said smoothly, "I wasn't asking for your permission." She turned toward the back of the courtroom and gave a subtle nod. A door opened. Footsteps echoed against the polished floor. "Judge Howard Gates," a firm voice announced, "you are under arrest." Gasps erupted from every corner. Reporters fumbled for their phones. Cameras clicked. The jury gaped. Even the defendant, who'd expected this trial to be a formality, looked stunned. Gates didn't turn, didn't speak, just sat there, eyes fixed on his bench, as if he could will it all away. Two uniformed officers flanked him. One reached into his pocket, the other pulled out cuffs. "This is absurd," Gates muttered, the fight draining from his voice. The officer didn't blink. "You have the right to remain silent." The sound of metal clicking shut was deafening as the cuffs locked around his wrists, sealing his fate in front of the people he'd ruled over for years. The once commanding figure behind the bench sat frozen, his expression a mask of disbelief. The courtroom buzzed with stunned murmurs, disbelief crackling like electricity. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, hands flying across notepads. Even the jury couldn't hide their shock. Bondi stayed seated, her face unreadable. This wasn't about gloating or revenge. It was about justice. Gates finally spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You can't do this." The officer holding his arm didn't flinch. "Sir, you are being taken into custody for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power. You'll have your chance to speak with an attorney." Gates yanked against the cuffs, his face flushing. "This is a disgrace. I am the law in this courtroom." Bondi stood, straightening her blazer. "Not anymore." His head snapped toward her, arrogance replaced by something closer to fear. The officers pulled him to his feet, but he resisted. "This is political. This is—" Bondi shook her head. "This is accountability." The room fell silent again. A lifetime of unchecked. Power vanished in an instant. Gates's face twisted, his jaw clenching as he scanned the gallery, searching for an ally. No one moved. It wasn't a mistake. A few feet away, the defense attorney had gone ghost white. The developer, Charles Lawson, who'd thought his influence could shield him, gripped the table's edge, his breathing shallow. Bondi let her eyes linger on him for a second before turning back to Gates. "Your Honor," she said, calm and measured, "if you have anything to say, I'd suggest you save it for your arraignment." His mouth opened, then shut. There was nothing left to say. The officers escorted him toward the side exit, but before they reached the door, Lawson shot up, his chair scraping the floor. "Wait! Wait!" His eyes darted between Gates and Bondi. "This is getting out of hand. We can work something out." Bondi turned, arching an eyebrow. "Work something out?" He swallowed, unraveling. "I mean, there's no need for this kind of public spectacle. Let's be reasonable." She studied him, then took a step forward. "You seem nervous, Mr. Lawson." He shook his head, forcing a laugh. "Nervous? No, this is insane. You don't seriously believe Gates is guilty, do you?" She let the question hang before answering. "Do you?" Silence. The officers led Gates out, and the door shut behind him. The weight of the moment settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was the unraveling of a system protected for far too long. And Bondi wasn't done. She glanced at the jury, the empty judge's seat, then the defense table. "I believe we still have a trial to finish." But everyone knew this was only the beginning. The courtroom felt lighter now, as if years of corruption had lifted in an instant. Gates was gone, hauled out in cuffs, the shock still lingering like a symphony's final note. Bondi took her seat, adjusting her papers. The trial wasn't over, but the biggest obstacle had been removed. She turned her attention to Lawson, who'd gone eerily quiet. His smugness was gone, replaced by something colder, more calculating. He was assessing the damage, how much of his safety net had been ripped away. Without Gates, his legal team would have to argue on merit, and they had none. She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Lawson, would you like to continue today's proceedings, or would you prefer to discuss a plea?" His jaw clenched. "This is a witch hunt." She gave a small smile. "No, Mr. Lawson. This is justice." He scoffed, shaking his head. "You think one corrupt judge changes anything? You think this means you win?" She let the silence stretch, the weight sinking in. "I think it means the system still works," she said finally. "That no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, the truth will always catch up." Lawson exhaled sharply, but had nothing left to say. The judge's seat remained empty, but it didn't matter. This case was no longer in his hands. One of Bondi's colleagues leaned in. "This might be a good time to push for a deal." She considered it, feeling the shift in the room, the jury watching, waiting. They'd just witnessed something unforgettable, but she wasn't about to let this end quietly. She stood. "Your Honor," she paused, correcting herself. "To the presiding judge who will take over this case, I'd like to submit a formal request to proceed with additional evidence. Given today's events, it's clear we need a full investigation into how far this corruption reaches." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. "Judge Gates was only part of the problem," she continued. "If my team could uncover this, it means there's more names, more people who thought they were untouchable." She turned to Lawson. "So I'll ask you again. Do you want to talk?" He sat rigid, fingers tapping the table, weighing his options. Then finally, he exhaled. "If I do, I want protection." She nodded slowly. "Then you'd better start talking." The courtroom wasn't the same place it had been an hour ago. The balance of power had shifted, the walls protecting the powerful had cracked, and Pam Bondi had sent a message. No one is above the law. As the bailiff called for order and the trial prepared to move forward, reporters rushed to get their stories out. This wasn't just another case, it was history, and it was only the beginning.